So in case anybody doesn't know, Roger's actually driving right now, so his connection can be spotty at times. So Roger, I'm not sure if you can hear me. You were cutting.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, perfect. So I guess my position is it would sound
This is a pretty baller profile picture Roger's got here. Is that actually him?
radical to the average person, but to an anarchist, I sound like a statist because I believe that we should have some level of government. It's a radical idea, I know, to anarchists, but I think that military, police, and courts are something that's a net benefit to society if what our goal is to do is to protect liberty. It's not enough to simply say that we believe that life rights and property are worthy of protecting, but we actually have to have the systems in place in order to do that. I don't see how we can do that without those institutions, and that's my position.
All right. I think that's a pretty good starting point. So I guess we'll just run with the question, do we need government? And if we need government, what is the benefit of that government? Why and why not? Roger, if you want to take that one first.
Yeah, I think it's quite simple. So if you get back to this concept of these Lockean principles of life, rights, and property, we have to think about, okay, well, what are we going to do to ensure that those things are protected? And I would imagine that the arguments against this is that government's done a bad job of doing this. But the question is what would you compare that to? The lawlessness of not having courts, the lawlessness of not having police, the lack of protection.
So I can see why Roger gets confused here, because there are a lot of anarchists that oppose courts and police, but under anarcho-capitalism, you would still have courts and police that would be supplied by the market, not the state. So his argument seems off base here.
Of not having a military to defend against enemies that do not share your values of life, rights, and property. So I think that in order to be able to protect those rights, you have to have those systems in place. And what we should be striving for is how do we optimize those systems to make sure that they do just that. No more, no less.
Well, I would say on this point of do we need a government, definitely not. It's just a general rule of economics that the free market can more efficiently provide any sort of good. You can imagine this rule doesn't particularize on
opting for the utilitarian argument.
Any sort of type of good. It's any good. And I mean, the minarchists, sometimes they'll go into like, well, doesn't apply for public goods, but the minarchists accept that the free market can indeed provide public goods. They understand that the free market can provide things like roads and stuff. It's just for this one specific area that the minarchist thinks there's something different. And Roger was anticipating that perhaps my argument would be that the government does a bad job at this. I think I would actually go far stronger than that. I think the government are the criminals that we need protection from. It's not just that they are incompetent at protecting us from criminals. They are themselves the criminals that we need defense from. So it's like a rights infringing protection agency. It's just a contradiction in terms.
And exactly how would you take that, Roger?
Yeah, no, I understand that position. I've heard it many times, and I think philosophically, I understand where people are coming from when they say that, that somehow, if we were to rid the world of governments, that everything is going to be better. And as someone that does embrace the free market, I do think that the free market does provide in terms of competition for many things. But the one thing that I would hesitate towards instituting is the competing nature of, people will talk about competing security agencies, or how would competing militaries work? If what we're trying to do is establish a society that has a standard, and if we could agree upon, and hopefully we can, the standard is protecting life, rights, and property. If that were the standard we're looking to protect, what if the security agencies and the military apparatuses that were competing with each other didn't agree upon that standard? And based on whose authority
they submit to binding arbitration. The incentives for cooperation are so strong that there is very little incentive, very little reason to resort to conflict. So these firms would have repeat dealings with each other because they're looking after various. You have a city and the individuals from one defense rights organization are constantly interacting with individuals from another. So they're going to have repeat dealings, and they're going to find a way to negotiate through conflicts smoothly and with the least amount of cost, and that'll be arbitration when their policies even differ. Probably most of the time they won't, because firms generally tend to find a good playbook. So probably a lot of the time they'll have ways to cooperate. They won't even be in conflict in the first place.
authority do they have to institute a new standard? And that's the thing that we have to ask ourselves is, do we have an agreed upon standard? And if we do, then these competing agencies, where are they bound in terms of defending that standard? You're going to need an arbiter in the case of disputes. Now, I would imagine that I'll hear that we could do that privately. I'd love to hear some of those examples. It's going to sound to me.
Already, the vast majority of disputes in the United States are handled privately through arbitration. There's a massive arbitration industry because the state court systems work so poorly.
Though, that when we hear the description, we're going to describe something that's very similar to what we have today in terms of somebody's going to do policing, somebody is going to
Yes, private police will function similarly to state-run police, in that they're still police. They're still trying to apprehend criminals, but there's categoric differences, like the fact that they don't have a monopoly, that you can withdraw your support for one police force, you can fire them and hire another defense rights organization.
Try to hear a case, and somebody's going to ultimately make a decision. I feel like we've already figured that out in terms of the laws that we have. And if you think that a private market would do it, I'd like to understand how these competing agencies can unify under one standard if there's no central authority that says that this is the standard that we've agreed upon. Like, for example, and here'd be the question, what happens if you have ANCAPs on one side and you have ANCOMs on the other side? Who's right in those disputes over something like property? One makes the claim that property is theft. The other says that property rights are essential. You're going to need somebody to handle that dispute.
Well, clearly the ANCAPs are in the right. Property rights are essential.
I would say that's called a judge.
So I would say in the dispute between the ANCOM, who thinks that property is theft, and the ANCAP, who thinks that property is not theft, well, we can definitely just say that the ANCOM is entirely incorrect there, because theft means stealing somebody's property. So property itself can't be theft. It's a stolen concept. They've stolen the concept of theft, which relies upon the prior definition of property, which they are trying to deny the validity of. So the standard thing, the standard is objective law. I think there's an objective natural legal theory that jurists can explicate. And philosophers have been doing this for a while now. Murray Rothbard, he has He isn't saying it's the NEP because we all agree that it should be the NEP. No. It's the NEP because that's objectively how you should be resolving conflict. So the standard we want would be with that objective legal body, which is then applied by competing firms. We don't want a standard with respect to the enforcement of rights, which was what was suggested prior.
There's also the common law tradition as a means of looking at what law is and how it's applied.
We just as we don't want a standard with how your food is provided and who provides it and what methods they use, right? We don't want a standard there. We don't want a one-size-fits-all solution. Maybe I have very specific security concerns and I want to put a lot of money into my security, and this is just something that a minarchist state could never capture because they suffer from the economic calculation problem. So I suppose I'll turn that question on to you, Roger. How exactly, how much rights enforcement is the state going to be providing to each person? Like, is it giving each person a tank and 3 handguns? Is it putting an armed guard out on every street corner? Or is it just like having a recurrent, really incompetent system? Like, how much rights is it? How much resources is it putting towards?
For example, go report petty theft to the police and see what they do. They have a monopoly on policing, but they don't even want to do their job when it comes to crimes committed against you or a simple assault. They're not going to investigate that. They couldn't care less, or they don't have the resources or whatever. But most firms are going to be more responsive to their consumers than to tell them, oh, well, we don't care, go away, which is what would happen if you reported most crimes to the police under the current state monopoly system.
Enforcement of people's rights. How does it determine this in a non-arbitrary way, right? How are you resolving the ECP here?
And that's actually a good question. Even in a broader picture, how do we ensure that the right amount of resources are directed to police? For example, Ben Shapiro, when asked what to do about Detroit, he said, the first thing you have to do is just flood the area with police. And basically that'll make it safe or whatever, and then it can flourish. Now, I'm not going to take a position on that suggestion, although I don't think it would work. I guess I am going to take a position on it. But that raises the question: how many police should we send to to Detroit? So what percent of total national income should go to policing? Okay, and there's no way to answer that question. I mean, you could answer it. Obviously, anybody can answer it. They say more or less the same, but there's no objective basis for that. It's just one person's subjective analysis of the value of policing versus other products. And that's true for any state monopoly. How many roads should we build? How much of the national income should be direct to infrastructure? Because there's opportunity cost. The more bridges, and roads you build, the fewer houses and factories and shoes you can build. I guess the shoes we're importing from overseas, but the fewer shoes you can import from overseas. There's only finite wealth, right? So people always champion infrastructure spending. I think it's great, but how much money, of what percentage of the national income should be spent on infrastructure? There's no way to answer that question when the state is the organization that provides infrastructure. When you have infrastructure socialism, but if you have a market economy, then that's going to tell you precisely whether you need more resources being directed towards a specific industry. If there's increased demand and supply stays the same, then the price will go up, and more resources will be allocated there by profit-seeking entrepreneurs. And that's true for policing, for infrastructure, for everything. So with the price system, we can ensure that scarce resources are allocated to the most efficacious ends, and with state monopoly, you're guessing. You're just guessing.
Yeah, well, interesting that you bring up the ECP, because I don't believe the ECP applies here, because we're not talking about setting prices. What we're talking about is something that's closely related to that, which would be the knowledge problem. And I think that that begs a good question of what.
No, the ECP does apply here. What Mises said in economic calculation of the socialist commonwealth.
What would you ask this police agency, whether private or government ran? What would you ask them to do? And I think that where you and I would probably find some agreement here is that we don't want people to, you shouldn't hurt people and you shouldn't take their stuff. I think that's a pretty basic thing that's commonly agreed upon between anarchists and minarchists. But when you're asking, what would the state provide? What I would be looking for is that if we agree that you shouldn't hurt people, and we take a crime like murder, let's just use that. If somebody murders someone, we need to be able to investigate the truth claim about, did a murder take place? If we're accusing somebody, how do we determine innocence or guilt? And you have to have an authority that is responsible for making that decision about innocence and guilt, because you.
So this is that's a good question, and one of the things I find interesting about Rothbard's writings on this topic is his championing of both vigilante justice and justice being delivered in advance of a trial. So these are radically different ways that crime might be dealt with under the Rothbardian system than under the status quo. But it makes sense to a degree. Like, let's say I witness a murder, you shoot my only son in cold blood. Who is better positioned to immediately determine your guilt and deal out the punishment than myself right there if I had a gun? So under the Rothbardian system, I would be permitted to execute you in revenge, essentially acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Of course, if it turns out I was wrong, then I would be a murderer like any other, and my own life would be forfeit, as Rothbard championed the death penalty. So,
you and I will agree that I would imagine that murder should be outlawed, whether it's
yes, murder bad.
Whether it's in with no government or with even within an authoritarian regime, you would think that we would agree at the very least that murder is bad. And if we're going to do that, then we have to be able to say, how do we prove that somebody murdered somebody, and then what do we do about that? And I don't understand how these competing agencies that might have different thoughts about this are going to be able to reconcile this. Imagine if you have a judge that doesn't believe that murder is bad. Or what if you had
well, that guy wouldn't be a judge. Like the court, because there'd be a private court too, and it'd be its own little business. Like, they wouldn't hire the judge to be part of their court. You have more than one judge on a court, because they got to rotate through and take cases randomly. So yeah, I'd be like, during the interview, I'd be like, oh, I don't believe in murder. They'd be like, next. That's pretty basic, that you have to know all the laws to be a judge.
What if you have
this well-funded private security agency that can buy the judge. Where's the entity that can protect against that? I think we have to think about who do they get their authority from, and we have a concept that the government should be.
So a judge could be bribed in the socialist system as well. What judges and courts are really selling is the impartiality and the fairness of their verdicts. So if a judge were to take bribes, I think word would get out. People would catch on. Scholars would look at the verdicts and be very surprised, and then you can do like a sting operation and catch them, or go to a different court that had a better reputation. So it's possible bad things can happen in an anarcho-capitalist society. We're not utopian. Just as bad things can happen in a state-run society. But there are mechanisms for improvement that exist in an anarcho-capitalist society, which might not in a statist society.
Be held accountable to the consent of the governed.
I mean, just right off the bat, you're concerned about a security agency buying off a judge and controlling the judge's decisions, but that's exactly the system you propose. You're proposing that it's all one entity, that you have one big entity which is doing all of the defense and it's doing all of the arbitration, and all of the decisions are coming from this entity. Your reduction of my argument is the argument you're making, right? So it's and then you ask, what if a judge?
I don't think that follows. He was saying, what if the agency buys off the judge, and Zulu says that's the argument he's making? No, he's making an argument for a state-run legal system.
Thinks murder isn't bad. Well, this judge is incorrect, right? Because it's not the judge's job to come up with law. It's not their job to decide what is guilt and what is innocence.
Of course he's incorrect. He believes that murder is okay. That's a stupid position. Everyone knows he's incorrect. The question is, how do you prevent him from being a judge?
Their job to apply an objective body of law which can be explicated by legal theorists. Right, that is the job of the judge. So, how are you determining innocence or guilt? You claim that we need an authority to do this. This is false. We need epistemology. Truth does not come from the say-so of some authority. It's true whether or not the authority recognizes it's truth or not. That is not how you validate any other truth claim. You don't validate whether or not gravity exists by saying, well, we need to have some sort of authority on this to decide whether or not gravity exists. No, you just go out there and investigate it, right? And you also claim that the ECP doesn't apply here, because rather the knowledge problem. This is false. The ECP applies wherever you have a single will directing the factors production. Here you have a single will directing all of the factors production in the rights enforcement industry, right? So it's not complete socialism, I agree there, but you still do have this one will who is deciding where all the tanks go and where all the guns go and everything like that. That is still a single will directing those factors production.
So he's right there about the ECP, economic calculation problem. But I would have liked to hear Zulu address the points that Roger made. He's basically just saying that's false, and I think he's not really refuting the arguments.
Production within this industry, so you still have the economic calculation problem.
Yeah, we're going to have to agree to disagree there, because again, the economic calculation problem speaks specifically to how the knowledge problem applies to setting pricing, and so I still don't know where pricing comes into this. No, it's a very specific thing.
That's not true. It's about how resources should be allocated. Mises proved that socialism could not work because it could not distinguish more or less valuable uses of social resources, and predicted the system would end in chaos. The result of his proof was a 2-decade-long socialist calculation debate. So, I guess they're both right in that it is about the price system, but it's also about the allocation of resources. So, I would say Zulu is more right than the other guy, because the other guy's saying it doesn't apply. Well, it does apply. It's about the allocation of resources. How many police should we hire? How many judges should we hire? Without a price system derived from the actions of entrepreneurs and consumers, you're never going to get an objective answer to how many resources should be directed towards jurisprudence and order versus other goods or services. I gotta say, overall, I feel like this debate has been less than terrific.
But I don't think we should get bogged down on the details of that, because I think you and I would agree that that central planning has its downside, and the downside is that when you start interfering into a market, it's problematic, not just because of pricing and knowledge, but that you're also encroaching on the rights of others, and you're making decisions around specific regulations that govern business. I would personally like to see in a minarchist society, and this is where I would probably differ from most minarchists. I don't want the government involved in the market at all. Like I said, the only three things that I think government's purpose should be is to provide.
Ayn Rand put it best: the separation of state and economy.
Protection against foreign foes in terms of the military, enforcement of agreed upon laws, and then the adjudication of those things. So again, I would put the ECP aside. But if you disagree, I think outside of this conversation, I'd love to understand how you get there with the ECP. But I do appreciate that your grievance about central planning is noted and agreed that it has its inefficiencies.
Right, but I'm definitely still saying that it applies in this debate, right? So the way you get to there is no prices, right? That's the central problem, is that you don't have this price mechanism. You don't know whether you're being efficient or inefficient. It is because you have no competition within this industry. They're not buying and selling factors, right? They just have the factors that they have, and they can just take whatever factors they want. They don't have to pay for any of this shit, right? So they don't have any factor prices. There is no trading of the tanks and the bombs and the nuclear weapons. So there are no factor prices. So therefore they still can't do profit or loss calculations. They can't determine whether they're being inefficient with.
Seems he's moved on to talking about national defense instead of the legal system.
Their allocation of resources. So they can't economize, right? That is the ECP in a nutshell.
Yeah, and again, we can do this circle all day if you prefer to do it, but because to your own admission, there is no pricing that we're talking about. The calculation problem is not the issue; it's the knowledge problem. But again, we can do this dance.
No, that's the whole point. Is that
Okay.
This Roger guy does not understand what he's talking about. The whole point is you don't have prices because the government's doing it. It's socialism, and hence the calculation problem.
Well, I would like to pose a question here to hopefully keep the
Finally, the moderator enters the chat. Where the hell's this guy been all show?
conversation moving. So the one thing that I see as being the problem with government is it takes away the incentive to actually deliver on any promises that they make. So, but I also
Who is they?
see how it could possibly work that way in ANCAP or an anarchist society. So, if both of you want to take a minute to explain exactly how would the incentive in what you're proposing, how would that look in any of these societies?
I would say in the ANCAP one, it's pretty
What was the question?
clear that you have a very direct monetary incentive to deliver on what you said you're going to do. Otherwise, there will be all these other insurance firms which are going to come after you for reneging on your contracts and everything. You have, if like the best way to make a pizza restaurant is definitely not to take people's money and then never give them the pizza, right? Even if you don't have some security agency knocking on their door, that's just, nobody's going to go to that fucking pizza restaurant. They're going to say, don't go to that pizza restaurant, it's a scam, right? That's, you're not going to make very much money there. McDonald's didn't decide, I know how we can make money. Let's just take people's orders and then just never give them the food. Great, word of mouth will spread like wildfire. We'll be having punters lined out the door. It's like, yeah, clearly that's not going to happen, right? So there's a very large incentive there to actually provide the product promised. Whereas with government, there's no incentive. They don't even know whether they're not delivering the product promised because they have the UCP. They don't know this, right?
Yeah, I would argue that it becomes an example of rational self-interest. Again, with what I'm arguing in support of, you have a rational self-interest to defend your standard of living, your the standard in which you want to regulate your society, and that would be against foreign threats. So the military has their incentive to make sure that that you're protecting your very existence and your belief system from an invader that may want to imprison you, may want to kill you, may want to slaughter you. And
people always ask anarcho-capitalists, how will you defend your society from invasion? Which is a fair question. But I think the opposite question, which is, how would an anarcho-capitalist country invade another country? And the answer being they couldn't, it is equally important, if not more important. The worst thing in the world is war, and an anarcho-capitalist society would not be able to wage a war of aggression, because waging a war of aggression is extremely expensive and requires both the ability to levy taxes and the ability to debase the money supply in order to finance it. So, anarcho-capitalists, if we took over and ran the world, there would be no war. And even just to the degree that one country became anarcho-capitalist, that country wouldn't be able to wage war on its neighbors. Maybe we might get invaded. Maybe we might get taken over. That's true. But we wouldn't be invading or taking over any other country. Can you say that about your political ideology, about your philosophy? And if not, why are you advocating for a system that's an impediment to world peace?
So those incentives are pretty clear. That's just rational self-interest. When it comes to policing, when it comes to the court system, it's the same thing. We have a vested interest in making sure that if we're agreeing that life, rights, and property is what we want to protect, then the incentive is that we do that, and we do that properly.
Is it? Because, as Bastiat said, when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men in a society, over the course of time, they create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. So our current legal system authorizes and glorifies plunder.
And I believe that in a more optimal world, we wouldn't.
I guess, to be fair, this might not be the case under his limited government society. That's the case under our society as it is today. Shouldn't necessarily equate the two things.
necessarily need police stations the way that that they're developed now, where you have a mayor that selects a police chief. I actually prefer the sheriff model, where you actually elect the sheriff, and if the sheriff's not doing a good job, you can replace the sheriff. I think that's a far better model, and then everybody's operating in their.
You know, it's an even better model. Have the police supplied by the market.
Own rational self-interest, the voters voting for their sheriff, the sheriff that wants to keep their job, and all of the deputy sheriffs that want to keep their.
I mean, why are you endorsing democracy? Aren't you a libertarian? Like, this is antithetical to what we believe.
Their society protected and upholding that standard that they're sworn to protect.
Well, I'd say just real quickly to that, if you're electing the sheriffs in your minarchist society, what you're going to have is you're going to have Hoppe's problem with democracy cropping up, which is, I suppose, parsimonious given the whole beginning to this was a disagreement over Hoppe. So if you are electing the sheriff, what he's saying...
Parsimonious. Unwilling to spend money or use resources, stingy or frugal. In research, parsimony reflects the notion that researchers should strive for measurement models that use the minimum number of parameters needed to explain a given phenomenon. I believe the word he was looking for was serendipitous, occurring or discovered by chance in a happy or beneficial way.
He could be out next term, right? He's incentivized to try and reap as much in the short run as he possibly can. And he's incentivized to, maybe the majority of people in this minarchist state are white, and they really dislike black people. Well,
just a note, when doing these hypotheticals, it's best to say, like, have dark hair and hate red-haired people. It's funny because Zulu's red hair, I didn't even think about that. But it's something, less sensitive than hating black people.
Vote.
I'm sure he doesn't mean anything bad by it, but...
say, well, what we can do is we can legalize slavery again, and I will enforce all of this slavery, and I'll stop the runaway slaves. And it's like, yeah, great, we'll put the rubber stamp on that, and, the 13% or, 50%, low numbers of black people in this society, they're not going to be able to win that vote. And they don't have any protection, because we have a monopoly protection agency. Whoops-a-daisies, right? That's not very good, so I would just really deny the premise, the implicit premise here, that if you have a democratic vote over something, that's...
I don't know. It seems like, in the context of modern society, that's highly unlikely to occur. Although I could see maybe other ways, other sort of abusive policies that could be implemented by an elected sheriff, maybe. It just seems like in Western liberal societies, that sort of policy wouldn't fly. Although the Dutch guy recently got elected on an anti-Muslim campaign, so who knows?
Somehow makes it justice. That justice is not determined by agreement of the majority, or by the will of some authority, or anything like that. Justice is natural and objective, right? So how are you resolving this issue with having this incentive for the sheriff to grub up votes at the expense of justice?
Yeah, well, I think the problem with what you just outlined is the understanding on how on what the role of a sheriff would be. A sheriff doesn't create the laws; a sheriff enforces the law, and so again, you would be hiring a sheriff to enforce the existing laws, not to make them. And so I think that's the problem in the argument that you're making. So if you your argument, I can respond to it, but the argument that you're making was one that was very much not rooted in any reality of an argument that you or I would be advocating for.
Right. So maybe even for the sheriff, then he could just say, "Well, I'm just not going to enforce any of these laws against killing black people."
Yes. So this is true, that you could have a malevolent sheriff. This is true. We see this in fiction. We see this in reality. I guess my question I would throw back to you would be,
You ain't from around here, are you, boy?
a private security agency that's hired by the same society that would be voting in a sheriff. If the will of those people that are then, instead of voting with their with their vote, but voting with their resources in terms of hiring a security agency, how do you fend that off?
Well, because war is very expensive. You no longer have this monopoly agency, which is doing all of the protection. You have a bunch of agencies. So the black people can have their own agencies. They can also subscribe to agencies. And then you've got very quickly all-out civil war, which is a much harder prospect than just the government saying, yeah, we're washing our hands of the situation, just do whatever you want to those blacks. Right? That's lynch mobs are far easier in the monopoly agency world.
Yeah, no, you're making an interesting point, and I have to say this is probably one of the funner conversations I've ever had with an anarchist, because I can tell that you've put a lot of thought into this, and with that, I would love to hear your answer to what would happen if we did institute these anarchist ideas to prevail. The majority of anarchists globally are ANCOMs. And so in these competing agencies, what if the best funded, most resourced, and most supported by the masses was a security agency that supported anarcho?
Well, to start with, I mean, if we're presupposing an anarcho-capitalist society, then you've got to have pretty broad-based support for a free society. I mean, if the vast majority of people in society are ANCOMs, it's game over. Doesn't matter if you have a state, you don't have a state. I mean, that is a death cult. Luckily, it's only a tiny fraction. But, you know, by the time you get to this point that you have an anarcho-capitalist society, you're going to have, you know, probably at least 15 to 20%, like, die-hard anarcho-capitalists, core ideologues, you know, really driving the conversion of society, and then broad support or even tacit acceptance among, you know, and I'm just throwing out numbers here, 50-60% additional, you know, and then maybe a few people who oppose it or whatever, but you have to have the majority well on board to have this society in the first place. That's what you're presupposing when you assume that you're in an anarcho-capitalist society.
Communism. Would that raise any concerns for you with your less well-funded ANCAP security agency?
It would certainly raise concerns, and that's why I would be wanting to be well defended, be somewhere holed up where they perhaps can't get me. But yes, at the end of the day, if 99% of people think that it's just A-okay for people to come and murder me, then there's not really anything I can do against that. Which is why, you know,
Except make one hell of a last stand.
Philosophy and strategy precedes any of this. You have to shift public opinion towards justice.
You fool! As if it matters how a man falls down. When the fall's all that's left, it matters a great deal.
And the rest will flow, right? You can't wave some magic wand and have the NAP be obeyed by everybody. That's not how the world works.
You're absolutely right. And if we play on that, that's not the way the world works. I would ask us to broaden this conversation and walk me through a scenario in which it's realistic that not only the Americans and the Europeans that hear your words about how anarcho-capitalism would work. What happens when the autocrats that don't think that that's the way the world should work? Let's just say, for example, Putin's Russia. Let's say China, countries that are armed with militaries that have nuclear arsenals. Do you think that it's prudent or to have anarchy if unless you had everyone on board? How would this work if we had autocratic threats that are well organized and possess weapons that that can create calamities on a global scale?
Well, I mean, I don't. If you have like an ANCAP US or whatever, I think that's the scenario being proposed. That would be perhaps the hardest territory on planet Earth to invade. And why on earth would China be wanting to nuke that if they can get a bunch of money out of it? I don't see that incentive there. I just don't see where.
Especially in this America, where they don't care what other countries are doing. If China wants to invade Taiwan or whatever, I mean, the ANCAP America would not be interfering with that, so there would be much softer targets there. I mean, people might interfere individually, but there wouldn't be a government that opposes that.
Where the real problem.
The other thing is, part of ANCAP is open borders, right? So the population of the USA might easily swell, 10 million, 20 million in a short period of time after opening the borders with everybody trying to move there. So in addition to the largest economy in the world, you could get to a stage where you have the largest population as well. Obviously, that would be down the road somewhat, maybe 100 years or whatever. But if you have open borders and everybody wants to move to your country, you're going to get a huge population, which would make invasion all that much more difficult, even without a centralized authority.
Arises. It's definitely a problem for the people who live in.
It'd be interesting to see if you could turn on a dime in a stateless society. And go from producing, automobiles to tanks, just like what happened during World War II. If all the companies would just sort of do that on their own, or turn into, combine the Transformers into some massive transformer into some massive wartime company. Or what would happen, or people just engage in resistance constantly.
In China, it's bad that they have to live under that. But really, yeah.
The other thing is, people always fearmonger about Russia and China, but historically, these countries have not been that aggressive, as repressive as they are internally. On the international front, they're practically pacific. Maybe you could argue that's because the U.S. government has been there as a foil to them, and that might be the case.
It's still prudent. It's always still prudent to have a just society. It's never prudent to go along with the murderers in their murder spree. You should just not do that.
Yeah, no, interesting. So we've agreed that if we set this up here in the U.S., that the enemies abroad, potential enemies abroad, would still have their weapons. You're arguing that they would have less incentive to do it, but I would argue that the concept of mutually assured destruction is what's prevented a nuclear exchange from taking place. The only nukes that have been dropped was unilaterally by the U.S. To end the Second World War, and then since then, as with the proliferation of nuclear weapons, that assurance that you would be destroyed if you were to launch your attack, the retaliation would destroy you, and so it would be it would be a very difficult game to win. And so my question then would be I
find the whole concept of mutual assured destruction to be pretty shaky. I mean, imagine you're in that situation and somebody sent a first strike against you as the leader of a country. I don't see how you fire back, You're already, and most people don't seem to have this problem when they're thinking about the situation, but, let's say your country is going to be entirely wiped out. 400 million people. Well, what good does it do to now wipe out all of Russia when in reality there's probably just like 2 or 3 guys that made that decision to make the first strike? How do you justify murdering hundreds of millions of people, which for all we know, a century from now or 2 centuries from now, they're going to be a free society without a dictator ruling over them? And how do you justify, the possible consequences of nuclear winter and maybe even eliminating the entire human race, or at least zonking us back to the Stone Age, when it's all good to posture as a means of reducing that first strike threat, but once that first strike has been launched, how do you possibly rationalize firing back, hitting back, and killing hundreds of millions of innocent people when I think the thing to do would be to just not fire back? Am I crazy?
In Ancapistan here in the U.S., who's going to have the nuke codes?
I mean, whoever homesteads them, I suppose. But I really don't see.
Well, it wouldn't be homesteading. You would build a nuclear reactor with or weapons with whatever material you can.
The incentive for China to go, oh, those people have freedom. Let's nuke them into oblivion. That's not how any terrorism has ever been done, to my knowledge. That's like the propaganda of the terrorists hate our freedom and that's why they want to destroy us. No, the terrorists have some very specific grievances about the US military invading and protecting Israel and whatnot. And that's why they're coming over and destroying things. I really don't see the reason why China would decide, oh, those people have too much freedom over there. Let's glass the entire United States. Why? What does that get them?
So your defense posture would be dependent on the idea that there's no incentive for China or Russia to use these weapons against us. But if they did, what would be what is our deterrent? What is our response?
My response would be, I don't know, probably burn alive. Hopefully I can get to a bunker in some time. I don't. Maybe you can get up like nuclear defenses, right? Those are a thing. But yeah, I mean,
Star Wars.
Yeah, if China wants to destroy the world, yeah, that's within their power, and I think that's a bad thing, which is why I don't want states to exist anymore.
So if the nukes were fired at Ancapistan would not fire nukes in return?
I don't know, some people might.
Interesting. Yeah, and is there going to be an objective standard that's applied that ensures that people don't fire these off? Because if people are homesteading and everybody's got their own nuke, I'm guessing that increases the risk that somebody might use them for applying less scrutiny than let's say the world has used over the last, say, 75 years, considering we've only used them, we've dropped 2 in a 75-year period, Brett.
Well, gas would definitely be the correct word there, because the only entity that has ever in the history of humankind used nuclear weapons on innocent people is the state, right? It's the United States government. That's the only group that has ever, in the history of all of mankind, used a nuclear weapon to kill innocent people. It's states which do this total war mentality of.
Still, I think he's evading the question. Could somebody theoretically assemble an ICBM in Ancapistan and then fire it off? I'd have to imagine that's prohibitively expensive. Maybe it's theoretically possible. It's actually a really good question, because obviously we don't want this to happen.
We must destroy everybody in that territory, because we as a collective are against them as a collective. That total war mentality is absent if you have methodological individualism, which you would have on a society-wide level in Ancapistan. I don't see.
Maybe disputes defense rights defense organizations might play a role there. I mean, if somebody's trying to acquire a nuclear launch capability, there might be some role for intervention there.
Where this, total war mentality would be derived from. What would be the philosophic basis for it in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I guess the part that I'm struggling with here is the pragmatic reality that there are people that do want to kill others. There are countries that are adventurous and want to invade neighbors. We saw that with Putin in Ukraine. We also see non-state actors because last time I heard the Palestinians don't have a state. They're a non-state actor. Not a state, and committing acts of depravity and barbarism and creating what is a state of war. And so that was initiated by a non-state actor. So the idea that a non-state actor is going to be less likely to wage war is just false on its face.
Well, I don't agree with the definition of the U.S. State Department says this isn't a state, therefore it's not a state. I think that's nonsense. They very clearly have a state. They're being ruled by Hamas at the moment. I believe they even voted in Hamas, right? So there's very clearly all of the normal...
Yeah, it was a while ago, I want to say 2006, very close election between Hamas and Fatah.
Practice of the state. And even if you think that, even if you're siding with Israel on the side of this disputed border or whatever, then they're still living under state, namely the state of Israel, right? So the Palestinians, whichever way you slice it, they've got a state.
Not exactly. In 1947, when the partition plan was offered to them, they declined statehood, and when statehood was granted to Israel,
that's not exactly what happened. Both sides were unhappy with the partition. The Palestinians had more of a of the land that was being given to the Jewish individuals. The majority of it is owned by the Palestinian peasants who had been living there and working the land. But what happened was, as this whole partition deal was going on, Zionist paramilitary forces were attacking the Palestinian security forces, and then Zionist terrorists killed about 100 women and children in a massacre in the middle of the night. And what happened was that the Palestinians were driven out of their homes, and about 750,000 of them were driven out of their homes and off their land. And this guy's really got quite the selective understanding of the history of the region.
Neighboring countries, on behalf of the Palestinian people, decided one day later, after Israel establishes its statehood, to declare war on them. So,
I mean, it was all Palestinian Arab land, pretty much, except for a small fraction belonged to the Jews. So they weren't really going to war on Israel. They were coming to the aid of the displaced Palestinians who had been driven from their homes by this violence against, by this terrorism against Palestinian women and children. They frame it as if they wanted to destroy Israel for no reason other than Israel was created, but that's quite historically inaccurate. They were Arabs coming to the rescue of Arabs on Arab land. So to portray this as an invasion, it's quite inaccurate.
And we have non-state actors that essentially want to see Jews eradicated, and I, for one, I like the that that a group of people that's been persecuted for thousands of years has adopted a mindset of never again, and has armed themselves in such a way to protect themselves from some of the most vile savages this planet's ever seen. So I actually think that Israel is a perfect example of why you need to be prepared to be able to battle non-state actors.
I mean, I'm not sure what this argument is really evidencing. My claim has never been that only states engage in murder or anything like this. That was never my claim. It's just, my claim would be, which I haven't made yet in this debate, is that states are by far the largest perpetrator of crime, like, bar none. So, yeah, it's a good idea to get rid of them. That isn't negated by saying, well, look, there's this guy in the Golden State who's serial killing all these women. Like, yeah, that's bad. And if only we didn't have a monopoly enforcement of rights, and then we could have actual competition here. These ladies could have their laser guns or whatever, and could, destroy them from orbit, right?
So are you of the belief that, because I hear the term thrown around a lot of the monopoly of violence of the state, are you in favor of democratizing violence?
I'm against democracy, so not in that sense of the word.
The definition of the state as the monopoly on force dates back to Max Weber, the German sociologist. I might describe the state as an organization with a monopoly on aggression and decision making or arbitrage. No, we're not. I'm not in favor of democratizing violence. I'm in favor of criminalizing aggression.
I'm in favor of having having competing firms, which would enforce an objective body of law. Would that involve them using violence? Yes. So in that sense, yes, I want there.
It's important to note too that libertarians and anarcho-capitalists are not opposed to violence per se, but aggression. We support the use of violence when it comes to self-defense or the defense of others, or when it comes to the redressing a criminal act. So when a criminal commits a crime, this causes a loss to the victim, and it creates a right of redress on the part of the victim to basically get their pound of flesh from the criminal. In a libertarian legal system, this would potentially take the form of restitution or some codified punishment fitting the crime.
Be competition in the realm of violence.
Interesting. So if we were more competitive violently, that would be a more optimal society in your position.
Yep.
Okay. Agree to disagree. Interesting. What?
Okay, you're not making an argument. You're just inferring an argument or insinuating an argument. Spell it out, buddy.
What is your thoughts on the fact that I would be in favor?
Love Zula's response, by the way. Yep.
Of abolishing all other state apparatuses. I would have to think that if there were a politician alive today that were advocating for the policies that I'm going for, that would probably be somebody that you would support in comparison to the alternatives that are out there. Is that correct?
Yeah, like Ron Paul or Javier Milei, right?
Yeah, Javier Milei. My favorite thing about him is when he waves the Israeli flag. It drives libertarians absolutely out of their mind.
Afuera!
when he waves that flag. I do love that he has a strong interpretation of the non-aggression principle that hasn't been compromised and watered down like some of the comedian podcasters in the libertarian movement that have moved from the non-aggression principle.
Is that a shot at Dave Smith?
To the non-retaliation principle, and so I'm very pleased that Javier Milei is a fan of the non-aggression principle in the traditional sense. I'm not sure if you share the more of
This guy's got a real hard on for Israel.
The of the comedian podcaster interpretation, or the one that Milei subscribes to.
I really don't give a shit about Israel Palestine, to be honest.
My man.
Fair enough.
So there's a couple of questions I wanted to
Jacob, are you still here?
pose, just to kind of get both of your guys' side.
Hopefully they're more coherent than the last one you asked, bud.
So, Roger, this first one's for you. So if we have a country or the reality of a small government
Is he playing the guitar?
somewhere in a territory, what is supposed to prevent that from becoming out of control, such as what we have
Excellent question.
now, growing exponentially to where it does become a problem?
Anytime you grant an organization a monopoly on arbitrage, decision making, there's no way to confine it to this neat little box of limited government because they're the ones that determine what their power should be.
And what is the solution if that did start to happen?
Yeah, I think the exercise is one of constant vigilance. It would be the same thing of how do you make sure that your weeds don't grow in your yard? Well, you're going to have to take care of that. In my case,
The tree of liberty must be renewed with the blood of patriots and tyrants.
Eric Gardner. There are unfortunate realities that people are going to want to usurp power for their own desires, and it's going to be an act of constant vigilance to beat that down. I think having a framework, though, that allows for us to agree upon a common standard is better than having competing frameworks that are going to be at odds with each other. I'm not a fan of democratizing violence. I'm not a fan of establishing multiple standards. I want one standard that we could at least strive to improve and adhere